And a little later on, Dennis McNally will be calling in from San Francisco. We'll be chatting with him about a new book that he's written called On Highway 61, The Music, Race, and the Evolution of Cultural Freedom. And Dennis, longtime publicist and historian, he wrote the book about the Grateful Dead, and actually Jerry hired him with the Dead, and he became their publicist. Also was working with Bob Ware after Jerry's death for many a year. But he'll be on 3 o'clock this afternoon talking about the latest book, and maybe even we'll delve into the 50th anniversary of the Grateful Dead. So Dennis McNally, our guest this afternoon, so stick around. More music coming right up. And welcome back to The Getaway. I'm Arty LaVigne, and joining us from San Francisco, California is Dennis McNally. And thank you for being part of our day today here, Dennis.
My pleasure, Arty.
I bet you the weather's just a little bit warmer and not as much snow, right?
I feel guilty every time I think of all of my East Coast family and brethren.
That's right. You do have family in the Boston area, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I went to high school in Maine and college where it was colder, believe it or not, than where you are.
Oh, okay.
We're up by the river, Messina.
Oh, Messina, New York.
Once a winter, Messina is listed as the coldest place in the United States.
Absolutely.
But it's like this cold air sink by the river. And we were just 20 miles away. So, yeah, no, I know about that.
Okay. Well,
I remember.
I know you do, but I just thought I'd stir that memory just a little bit today. Okay. So welcome to the program. We're here to talk about Highway 61, On Highway 61, your latest book, and it happens to be a great read. I had the chance to read it over the Christmas holiday, and I thought it was one of the best music books I had ever read about American music, and it truly is about the roots of rock and roll, and you decided the roots started somewhere in the 1800s, right?
Yeah,
Or your perspective and your research brought you back there.
Exactly. I really the book started with the question of what happened, what caused the 1960s to happen, what caused people to ask seriously challenging questions about what are thought of as traditional American values, like interpreting freedom as the freedom to make as much money as humanly possible. And for a lot of people, that question got, asked
right
in a very challenging way. And long story short, after a whole ton of research and questioning, I decided that modern America started in the early 1900s. This is not an original thought, I might add, when Alexander Hamilton's National Bank became a reality, and the United States turned into kind of the country that it is today, which is to say, business-wise dominated by corporations and a real economic juggernaut, which it hadn't been in the 18th century. And one of the first great witnesses to all this was Henry David Thoreau, noted Concordian, who literally canoed past Lowell, Massachusetts, which is where the American Industrial Revolution began. So I start from there, and from the fact that his politics were based on opposition to slavery. And it goes on through Mark Twain, who in fact witnessed slavery, lived with it as a Southerner in Missouri. And then by the turn of the century, you get this amazing round of creativity from the black people who had, at that point, the first generation who had been born after slavery, after emancipation, had come of age. And there's this blossoming of musical creativity. It's mostly music because that was sort of the tools at hand. And you can read, one of the ways you can read the 20th century is of white people encountering black music and being the better for it and being more civilized and learning. And it's very hard to retain prejudices against people if you're dancing to their music. I mean, you'd think, at any rate. And that's sort of been the case throughout the century.
So you started in the east, and you ended up in the heart of the Midland there with the river, the Mississippi River, and Highway 61, and the way that it goes from the Gulf to the north, or traveling south, either way, and ended up with Bob Dylan as well. But along that journey, I mean, it's just a fantastic story. So
it really is, and I'll take that a little bit as a compliment to the book, but the truth is, before you get to the book, the story of the river and the road and the way it influences America. For starters, so at the turn of the century, you have three forms of African American music that emerge. There's ragtime, and then the blues, and then jazz, which sort of, in some ways, combines all of it. And each of those forms was created within 50 miles of the river. Highway 61, for those of you who don't know, or who think that Bob Dylan made it up for a song title, is a real road that runs from the Canadian border, not far from his home, boyhood home in Hibbing, Minnesota, from the Canadian border all the way down to New Orleans. It ended literally at the foundations, where the foundations of the Superdome is
right.
now, or are now. The foundations are in New Orleans. And so it's synonymous with the river, and I always thought that the river had this profound impact on people. It's kind of mystical, and it's very hard to document. But from the beginning, the Middle West was thought of as this kind of traditional and conservative place, and yet right through the middle of it, you have this bolt of energy, literally, this massive river that just picks up speed and volume, going, draining the best part of North America. And I just don't think it's a coincidence that you have all this creativity near the river. And so I wanted originally to call the book The River and the Road, and then I thought of something my father told me. This is really, I mean it, I'm not joking. He once said to me, "Son, if you have to explain a joke, it's a bad joke." And that applies to titles. If you have to explain it, people would go, The River and the Road. What river? What road?
Right.
So that's why it became on Highway 61.
Yeah. And one of the things that you touched upon earlier about dancing to the music, it's hard to hate or distrust. The same thing happened on the river, where these bands were forming, and they had the river boats going and the steamships and everything, and they would have these bands coming on, and people were dancing to them. So it offered an avenue to express themselves through their music, whether it was the jazz, the ragtime, or the blues, right?
And yeah, in particular, that's the story of the Streckfus line, Streckfus. If you want to go Google it and look up and learn more. Streckfus, the original Streckfus, was a guy whose father was a real rigid person, and he came across the story of Huckleberry Finn and fell in love with riverboats and spent the rest of his life. This was sometime in the 1890s, I think. And for the next 30 or 40 years, he got involved with riverboats. And first, they were literally just for dancing. They were, excursion ships, and people would come on the river. It was, brutally hot. This was before air conditioning. And the idea was that you'd go out on the river, and there'd be a breeze. The boat would be moving, and so there'd be a bit of a breeze, at least a little breeze, and it would be cooler and be pleasant. And as their advertising copy put it, they danced their dreams, because the boats, these big, elegant-looking, almost like swans on the river. And fairly soon, they hired some of the very finest New Orleans musicians, including Louis Armstrong, to play on the boats. And people, both the black people coming out of New Orleans, who were pretty much used to playing for other black people. This is the first time they're playing for a largely white audience. The boats were segregated. It may not be. You may be shocked to learn.
Okay.
Or not.
Right.
They usually they allowed black people to buy tickets on Monday nights, but the rest of the time it was white only. And those boats ran from New Orleans and then mostly ran out of St. Louis, south and north, and they would go up into like Iowa, and they'd stop at a town and pick up people, and they'd go dancing. And it literally spread music, because this is, for some of these people, the first exposure to black musicians they'd ever had. And it's a fascinating, sort of side story in this whole process.
Right, and part of it is, it also gave the musicians an opportunity to see other regions and stuff, and some of them actually settled, whether it was Chicago or St. Louis or wherever. So it kind of spread the music as well, right?
Absolutely, and one of the things that the black people in particular early part of the 20th century, they were the fact of being able to travel, was something they cherished.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, literally, they're in slavery. Obviously, they had no such opportunity, nor in sharecropping. Getting out of once you got stuck in that, it was pretty hard to get out. And so, pretty early on, the musicians of New Orleans, in particular, started spreading out. Kid Ory went to Los Angeles fairly early in the process, and of course, most famously, Louis Armstrong
mm-hmm.
traveled to join King Oliver in Chicago. Chicago was the great, in the 1920s and 30s, far more than anywhere else. And really, I think to this day, it was the great black city. It was much more important to black culture at that time than, say, New York, which was Harlem became significant culturally, Duke Ellington and the Cotton Club and so forth. But it was a relatively small group of people, I mean, in the tens of thousands, whereas in Chicago you had 200,000 or 300,000 black people.
Which changed the dynamic of the city quite a bit.
Oh, it changed the city,
yeah.
and it just, if you could imagine being from, say, Mississippi, and a lot of the people in Chicago came from Mississippi, to go from being, at the absolute bottom of the social pyramid in, say, the Delta, and then you get to Chicago, and you see a black policeman, or a black mailman, or a black, whatever. It was remarkable. Or for instance, there's Muddy Waters as late as 1940. So we're not talking about the turn of the century. But
mm-hmm.
in 1940, it was not much had changed really from the turn of the century, and Muddy Waters worked as a truck driver, and I believe if I recall correctly, he was being paid 22.5 cents an hour for driving a truck at the plantation he lived on. So he was actually a step up from the average sharecropper who was, out there weeding
right.
cotton. And Muddy asked for a raise to 25 cents and was, basically told that if he didn't care to earn 22.5 cents an hour, he could get off the truck. He got off the truck. And a couple of days later, he took the train to Chicago. And he had whole town, half the town would move there. So you had connections. You
right.
had people to help you make the transition. He went from 22.5 cents an hour to $100 a week working in a box factory in Chicago. And granted, there were expenses in Chicago that there weren't in Mississippi, but clearly life was better.
Right. And one of the undercurrents that we really haven't touched about was a very violent period as well, leading up to all of this to attain that sort of freedom, right?
It's really one of the great ironies and it hadn't occurred to me, but it became obvious as the more you researched it. Here you have this explosion of black creativity right around the turn of the century, and at the exact same time, in particular from 1890 to say 1925, you have the absolute worst period of time for white superiority, for the notion that whites were superior, and that what I came to realize was it was the age of empire, where Great Britain, of course, the biggest was Great Britain, but there was the French had their colonial holdings in Africa and so forth and so on, and there was this notion, completely false, but because for a while Europe seemed to dominate the world, Europe and the United States together, and then the United States joins in that empire thing with Cuba and defeating Spain and taking over the Philippines. And suddenly, you have these so-called white countries dominating the entire world. And in the United States, as I put it, if the people of color in, say, Puerto Rico, which is now a Commonwealth of the United States, or at that point, I think it's still a colony, and the Philippines, if they weren't going to get the right to vote, and they didn't, Congress told them what to do, then the people of color in Mississippi weren't either. And so that the Supreme Court is, justifying all kinds of ways to make sure that black people can't vote. So it was, and that spread through. You've got the President of the United States watching Birth of a Nation at the White House. That was the first movie ever shown at the White House, and it's a brilliant movie. D.W. Griffith. There's fascinating things about it. It's also just racist as all heck, and just a very depressing thing to think about in that context. And that was true of any number of, the Klan was very powerful in the 20s, resurged, and so forth and so on. So yeah, there was this startling contrast. The music, if it was going to have a civilizing effect, and it did, it had a great deal to work against.
And you covered it pretty well all the way through, And so given all of that, how does Bob Dylan figure into this? I mean, I know he's a very important character and icon of the 60s, but how did you arrive at Bob Dylan being the pretty much the resource or the guy who took all of this to another level and made it?
What blew my mind, because, I certainly remember when Bob Dylan hit, and although I was 12 when his first record came out, but I heard it, and soon thereafter was singing "Blowing in the Wind" like everybody else. And I was a church kid going to New England churches were involved with the civil rights movement, and but I had the take, he's a folkie, he's a Woody Guthrie clone, and then I carefully one day listened to his first album, and I realized, if that's the case, how come all the songs are from black people? And they're about death, which is interesting, although true folk music actually touches on death a lot, and it's a lot realer. What I concluded after a while, on reading a whole heck of a lot of biographies about Dylan, is that the sources that he touched on, he was colorblind. There's something about him that he never chose to really, on some level, to worry about color, so that, for instance, the black sources of his music were just as important to him as the white sources. He switched from rock and roll, where, by the way, he was trying to be Little Richard,
right? Yeah.
to folk by listening to Leadbelly, and then to Odetta, et cetera, et cetera. So, in fact, what he did was bring black and white music together. It had been sort of separated by musicologists and by record companies in the 20s, teens and 20s, for reasons, lots of different, business reasons, racist reasons, all kinds of reasons. And it was foolish, because it simply wasn't so. Just as an example, people think of Jimmy Rogers. They call him the father of country music. Implicitly, they mean white country music, except that he yodeled. That was half of his act, and the yodeling he almost certainly got from black railroad workers. He sang blues. His greatest hit, Blue Yodel Number 9, he recorded with Louis Armstrong and Lil Hardin, Louis's wife. So,
right?
What's this about? Or the fact, just as an example of historical short-sightedness. So, for some odd reason, after the Civil War, black people pretty much universally, not 100%, but largely, gave up playing banjo and switched to guitar. So that when people started hearing string band music in the 19-teens and 20s, mostly played by white people, which evolved, among other things, into bluegrass, they thought of it as white people music. Except, of course, they were playing the banjo, which was an African instrument.
Right, yeah.
So, my standard line about all this is, when people ask me, what do you think of the music in America that isn't influenced by black music? And I say, you mean both albums? Because it touches at different times on everything, on singing, on church singing, going back to the Great Awakening of the 1740s. It's a very important source for American music, and it's an amazing story. And in the course of the 20th century, starting with the dancing, ragtime dances, I hereby apologize to my folks who when they danced the foxtrot in the 1950s, I thought they were I was a kid. What did I know? I thought that was the dorkiest looking thing I ever saw. And then I realized and learned that, in 1912, it was revolutionary. It was sensual. It had a sexuality to it, or a sensuality to it, that was new in American dancing. That's important stuff. How you dance says quite a lot about who you are. So, and all through, and then, of course, into the 50s. So to get back to Dylan.
Right, yeah.
Somebody asked me about if I had an aha moment in the course of my research, and I thought about it. It was a good question, which I hadn't thought of, and then I went, well, I did. And that was when I read Bob Dylan's Chronicles, and he talks about how, as a kid, he would listen to a radio show broadcast from the Deep South. One of the wonderful things about radio that I don't think so much exists anymore, because everybody listens to it on the internet. But once upon a time, even when I was a kid, you could listen to radio from 1,000 miles away after dark, and you did. It was fascinating to hear music from far away. And Dylan was deeply influenced by a guy named Gatemouth Page. He was a white guy. His nickname was the Mouth of the South, and he would play the best black music alive in 1956, 57, which is to say when Bob was in high school. And, late at night, there's Bob, with the radio low, probably under his covers, listening to, Magic Sam from Arkansas, which is one of the reasons why he stopped being Bob Zimmerman and became Bob Dylan. It took him out of the polka sound of hymning. And he talks about that in Chronicles, and he realizes that all of this is connected with Highway 61, so that when he writes this song, it's a real road. It's 40 miles from his house, and it's what connects him to the South, into the blues tradition, and to the river, and the river as well, which is also it starts in northern Minnesota. So, in a lot of ways, I just felt that Bob Dylan really was the sort of tied it all together.
Right.
And his interest and deep participation in the civil rights movement connected all this stuff, and so that's where I landed. Somebody asked me if because of course I'm associated with the Grateful Dead, and
right.
Somebody asked me if I couldn't have used the Grateful Dead, and I said no, I absolutely could have. I mean, they equally were part of this tradition. Except that they weren't, of course, connected with the river, except to fly over it.
Right. Yeah.
But they were certainly connected with it. But the fact is that I'd done that.
You've done the book already, right?
I've done that book. once was quite enough. Thank you very much.
It's another great read as well. So people should pick up on it, right? The long strange trip. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I welcome. I welcome that.
Can I get you back on Bob Dylan one more time about Highway 61? We were talking about that, and one of the things I read in researching and to talk to you today was something about Sam Cooke heard Blowing in the Wind and decided it was time for him to write A Change Is Gonna Come. Was that?
It's a great story. I did somebody asked me to do one of those lists of 10, right?
Right.
So I came up with 12.
Okay.
And 12 important songs that affected white people, black written songs.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, just to prove that it did go both ways, I told that story, which is it's my understanding that Sam Cooke was of course he came out of the gospel world, he went into the went into a secular R&B world and was a very, very successful musician and very wise, very, very, concerned with how he was perceived and the business. He was not naive about the business. He was not one of those guys that sort of got hustled, and he knew what was going on, and he was astonished at "Blowin' in the Wind" and its commercial success, and it gave him, in effect, permission to talk about issues he was more than happy to talk about, and but with the notion that I want to write a powerful song like this, but I don't want it, to be a stiff. And of course, "Change Is Going to Come" is just one of the great songs.
And it definitely comes from a gospel sort of feel as well.
Oh, so, all the way. Well, everything he did,
Right. Yeah.
It didn't. He never missed his roots, and it worked. It made total sense, just in terms of making it gospel. I mean, coming out of that church background.
So pretty much takes the premise that you have, and that the music just keeps going in a circular motion, basically, from the black to the white.
Musicians listen to other musicians,
right?
And they can't help themselves.
Yeah,
they got and they listen for what moves them, and you get the rock and roll, and you have this perfect sharing. You have a white guy like Bill Haley, who's a country western musician and DJ, and he starts listening to the show that followed his, which was an R&B show, and he starts playing the R&B show's anthem, and his audience goes bananas.
Right.
They liked it. His country western audience liked it too. Or you have a black R&B guitarist from St. Louis named Chuck Berry, who starts working on a country western song, which is derived from a song by Charlie Poole and the something or other, Ramblers, I forget. But anyway, it was called Ida Red, and eventually they changed the name to Maybelline. And bingo, you have this fusion of black and white sources, and it made perfect sense. And of course, the audience glommed onto it, and they've been happy with it ever since.
So the blues had a baby and named it rock and roll was the old Muddy Waters line, right?
That's a line, and I like it.
I like it too. It's right there, So
yep.
Bob Dylan, Highway 61, just a fantastic read. I mean, it took all these elements of music that I've read over the years, and it just tied it all together with, like you said, the river and the highway, but you're specific about it. And one of the things I just saw recently, I've been watching Dave Grohl's Foo Fighters' Sonic Highways, and he was down in New Orleans talking to Alan Toussaint and some of the Neville brothers and Dr. John, and they were telling how not that long ago where black and white musicians could not be on the stage together, otherwise they would be arrested. And Dr. John, that had happened to him in New Orleans at one time. And it just brings it all back to you that this is recent history, and it's ongoing today.
It's flabbergasting to realize that all this stuff is, I mean, it seems like so far away.
Right.
50 years.
It hasn't been that long.
50 years ago, and the Supreme, we got a Voting Rights Act that really worked. Of course, the Supreme Court is busily trying to rearrange that, but don't get me going on politics.
Okay.
As you say, what was the Faulkner line? The past isn't dead; it isn't even past.
Right.
It's all that stuff is still part of our lives.
Well, things have gotten better. There's no doubt about it.
I like to think that.
I'd like to think, it's half full at this stage, and we're moving in the right direction. But that stuff still comes and does have an impact today.
Absolutely.
And again, it just gives more credence to your observations on music and how it interacts with our culture, and that striving for freedom that started right on the plantations. So it's just it's an excellent read. And how can people get your book?
Well, you can go to DennisMcNally.com. You can go to your neighborhood bookstore, and if they don't have it, say, why don't you have it?
And they'll order it for you.
If you go to DennisMcNally.com, there's links to Amazon or whatever.
And right here in Waterbury, we have Bridgeside Books. I'm sure if you walk in, Hayetta would be more than happy to get the book if she doesn't have it right on the shelf for you. So you can do that as well.
I bet that's so.
I know so. So I would be remiss to not ask you this question. In 50 years, the Grateful Dead, how do you think this is going to go off in Chicago with the boys?
I think there's going to be a whole lot of crying on the night, and a lot of sad people. It's been one of the great rides, and I think it's wise for them to sort of draw a line and say,
this is it.
I mean, the whole idea of the 11th farewell concert tour is we've witnessed. I won't name names, but we've witnessed certain bands flog that one into the ground, and I certainly respect the members of the band in saying, look, we're going to do this, and draw a line.
Right. Are you going to be on hand for this?
I have some family obligations that'll take me.
Okay. That
I've committed to, and grandchildren trump even the Grateful Dead.
There you go. Grandchildren do. That's right.
Yes, they do.
So again, Dennis, I really appreciate you taking the time and talking to us today, and look forward to talking to you in the near future. But again, I urge everyone to check out your latest book. It is Highway 61, On Highway 61, Music and the evolution of the cultural freedom, race as well, and it's just it's an incredible book, a very important book that ties both the culture, starting with Thoreau, on to Mark Twain, and just the development from minstrel music all the way through jazz and blues and on to Bob Dylan in the 60s. It's pretty fantastic. So thank you, Dennis, for joining us here today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Arty.
Okay. Let's go out with Bob Dylan and that song.